My name is Emily Parker. I'm 30 years old and I work as an interior designer. For most of my life, I was the responsible one in the family, the daughter who always gave up her savings, her time, her peace, just so others could have what they wanted. I told myself it was love, but really, it felt more like being a walking credit card. I thought I finally had control over my life until one letter proved I did not. The envelope sat on my desk like it had always belonged there, thick paper with a neat return address from Bellamy Gardens that sounded expensive even before I opened it. I set my coffee down, told myself it was a mistake, then slid a finger under the flap and unfolded the contract. The numbers jumped first $100,000, due in tidy installments that looked official and calm, as if they were not about to upend my balance, my plans and the air in my chest. Then I saw my name at the bottom, written in a hand that wanted to be mine, but was not. The loops were too round, the slant too proud. Whoever signed it had practiced, and that thought turned my stomach, because only one person would practice being me for a wedding I had already said I would not pay for. My fingers went hollow and the cup slipped, hit the floor and broke across the wood in a hard sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Warm coffee spread to my bare feet. I did not move. I kept reading because I needed proof this was real. Names and dates and my sister Madison's bridal suite choices scattered through the pages like cheerful confetti. I could not shake off notes about lighting and flowers that meant nothing to me except the cost attached to each line. My phone was on the corner of the desk. The venue's number printed at the top of the contract, and before I could talk myself out of it, I dialed. A bright voice answered with the kind of smile you can hear. I gave my name. It felt strange to say it, and the voice warmed even more, saying how rare and beautiful it was to see this kind of generosity between sisters, how the whole team had been touched by my gift, how everything was moving along because of me. I opened my mouth to correct her and nothing came out. The words stuck somewhere between anger and shame. I swallowed and heard myself say, "Thank you," soft and wrong, then ended the call with a tap that shook. The apartment suddenly felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that lets your thoughts line up and march past whether you want them to or not. I crouched to pick up the larger pieces of the cup and stared at them in my palm, white ceramic with brown edges where the crack ran through, and I hated that it felt like a picture of my morning. I put the pieces on the counter, wiped my feet with a dish towel, and went back to the contract like I could will the ink to change. There was a clause about late fees and a schedule that assumed my cooperation, my signature on every page like a chorus repeating a lie. I pressed the bridge of my nose and tried to breathe the way the therapist at a work seminar once suggested, in through the nose, out through the mouth, but it only made the room sharper, the smell of coffee and paper and something burnt from the toaster I had forgotten to unplug. I thought about Madison holding up that ring 2 months ago, the way our parents looked at me when she flashed it. The expectation sliding across the table like a bill no one else would touch. I had said no, then quietly but clearly. I had said I could not and would not. Now there was proof that my answer never mattered. My hand steadied as a different feeling moved in behind the shock, something simple and solid. I took photos of every page, zoomed in on the signature, the dates, the notes in the margins that used my full name like a key. I opened a new email and typed a subject line to the venue's manager and to myself because I needed a record that began here. I did not send it yet. I was not ready to explain anything to anyone. I set the phone face down so I would not see it light up. I pulled a chair out and sat with the contract in my lap reading again, as if the second time might tell a different story, as if the numbers might soften or the signature might fade. They did not. The truth was steady and loud. Someone I loved had stolen my name to buy her perfect day, and my parents had let the story grow until even strangers believed I was the generous sister everyone talked about. I felt the tears start, the first one quick, the second slower. Not dramatic, just the body's honest answer to a door that had been closed on me one too many times. I wiped my cheek with the back of my hand and looked at the broken cup on the counter again, the pieces waiting like a choice. I could glue it back and pretend it was whole, or I could throw it away and admit it never would be. The contract lay warm from my hands. I set it flat on the desk and stood up. Shock had done its work. It had shown me the shape of the problem. Now I needed to decide what to do with it. I sat with the contract spread open on my desk, and as I stared at the fake signature, my mind slipped backward, uninvited, into all the other times my name had been taken, all the times my money had vanished in the name of family. I was 16 again, sticky from long hours at the ice cream shop, proud of the envelope my grandmother pressed into my hand at graduation. It was meant to help me start college, to buy books or pay for classes. A week later, it was gone, folded into Madison's spring break trip, because my mother had said, "Your sister deserves to celebrate too." I remembered the tight smile on my face when I agreed, the way it felt like I was being responsible, though inside I knew I had been robbed. Then came the years of tuition payments and loans. Every semester, I worked shifts between classes, and when the refund check came, my father called it a little help for the family. He said his business needed a boost. My mother said it was temporary, and I handed it over because I was the dependable one. I sat in the library with cheap second-hand books, telling myself I could manage while they used my money to patch holes I had not created. My chest tightened as another memory returned. Madison's car had broken down, and before I could even speak, my father announced Emily will handle it. I swiped my card for the repair, and weeks later opened my statement to see charges from boutiques and restaurants far beyond the cost of any mechanic. I had wanted to scream, but instead I paid the bill because no one else would. The memories piled like stones until I could barely breathe. And then, most painful of all, I saw us at the Sunday dinner table just 2 months ago. Madison had lifted her hand so the diamond caught the light, and everyone gasped. My father refilled his wine glass and looked straight at me. "Since you got that promotion, you'll help give your sister the wedding she deserves." My mother leaned forward, her voice smooth with certainty. "Family takes care of family." "Don't you want your sister to be happy?" Madison smirked, adding, "Come on, Emily, you can afford it." My hand shook under the table and I whispered, "I can't. I'm still paying my student loans." The silence that followed was worse than shouting. My father frowned. My mother sighed, and Madison pouted like a child denied candy. That silence told me my no was never going to be accepted. Now, staring at the contract, I finally understood. This was not sudden. It was not even surprising. It was the same pattern carried to its next step. They had taken graduation money, they had taken tuition, they had taken my credit card. And now they had taken my name. I touched the fake signature again and whispered to the empty room. They never asked. They never needed to. They just took. The resentment in my chest was sharp, heavier than the helplessness that used to drown me. For the first time in years, I felt something shift. The chains I had carried so long were still there, but now I could see them clearly. And once you see chains, you start to wonder how to break them. I pushed the contract to the side, opened my laptop, and searched my inbox because if I was going to fight this, I needed proof that spoke louder than my word. I typed the word wedding and watched old messages rise up like dust I had not touched in years. There it was, an email thread between my mother, my father, and Madison. The subject line used my name like it belonged to everyone. I clicked and read my mother's sentence first. "She will give in eventually. She always does." The words hit with a calm cruelty that made my chest feel tight. Madison's reply came right under it. "If not, we will figure something out. She has the credit for it." I could hear her voice in those lines, light and careless, as if the only question was which card of mine they would use. My father had written less, but it was enough. We need to secure the venue. Do not let this drag. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the heat in my face cool. They had not even tried to hide it. They had not waited for my answer, because in their minds, the answer did not matter. I took screenshots, then saved the whole thread, and as I did, a small clear thought arrived. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a plan. A memory tugged at me, a small detail from a Sunday dinner, when my mother left her planner on my sideboard, and I had set it in a drawer and forgotten it. I went to the bedroom, pulled open the bottom drawer, and there it was, the familiar smooth cover and her careful tabs. I carried it back to the desk and turned to the section labelled wedding notes. The handwriting was hers. If she refuses, tell relatives she already promised. My name appeared over and over next to items with tidy check marks. Venue, deposit, Emily covers. Flowers, check with Emily's card. Lighting, Emily can approve. I traced a line with my finger and felt something inside me go very still. This was not a daughter being asked for help. This was a budget written on my back. For a few seconds, I simply listened to the room, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, the small sounds that prove a life is still going, even when your understanding of it is not. Then, I took photos of each page, front and back, and placed the book on the table like an exhibit that would not move. I created a folder on my laptop and named it in a way I would not forget. I saved the images, the email thread, the contract, and a short note to myself about where and when I had found each thing. None of this changed what they had done, but it changed something in me. The feeling that I was trapped had been with me for years, and now it started to give way to something steadier. I looked at the forged signature again and read my mother's sentence once more. She will give in eventually. She always does. That line had carried me for so long, like a script I did not write. I spoke out loud to the quiet apartment, slow and clear, so I would hear it the way I wanted to remember it, not this time. My hands did not shake anymore. I sent copies of the files to my private email so I would have them if anything happened to the laptop. Then I put my phone face down because I did not want to see any messages from my family until I decided what to say. I knew what these proofs meant. If I moved forward, there would be no going back to the old role, the good daughter who fixed what others broke. That life had never protected me. It had only made it easier for them to take. I sat up straighter, breathed in, and felt the ground under me solid and real. They had written me as the solution to every problem they created. I was going to write myself out, and I carried that promise with me as I walked into my parents' house, ready to keep quiet until I chose the right moment. But the sound of too many voices told me this was not dinner. It was a stage. The living room was crowded with aunts and cousins and neighbours who did not usually show up for a Sunday meal. And before I could set down my coat, a circle formed around me, warm hands and smiling faces, calling me generous and thoughtful, and the kind of sister every family wishes they had. Someone said I was an angel for sponsoring the wedding. Someone else said I had a heart of gold, and I nodded because there was no room to speak, because every compliment was a box closing around me. Madison floated through the group in a pale dress that caught the light, holding a glass she did not seem old enough to deserve. She kissed the air by my cheek and said with a laugh that I had insisted on the best, that I was the reason her dreams were coming true, and the way she said it made my skin prickle. I told myself to breathe and keep my face even. I could feel the folder of proof in my bag like a steady weight against my hip, and it helped to know I was not crazy, that I was not making this up. In the dining room, my mother stood at the head of the table with her leather planner opened the same kind I had found in my drawer, and she tapped a spoon against a glass for quiet. She began a story about two daughters, one who dreamed and one who sacrificed. And when she said my name, the room murmured with approval. She lifted a page and read a line she had already written by hand, that Emily would not hear of anything less than the best, because family deserves it, and my throat went tight because I recognised the phrasing from the planner I had photographed. My father stepped in with his glass raised, smiling. In that way he uses with his golf friends, and said his eldest understood what matters, that I had insisted the venue be secured, and the flowers be upgraded, and the music be perfect, because that is what family means. People clapped. Madison bowed her head like a bride in a movie and dabbed at her eyes as if my kindness had moved her. I held my fork so hard my knuckles ached. The words rolled over me, and it was like watching my real life pushed off the table and replaced with a gentler story that made them look noble, and me look generous. If I spoke up, if I tried to correct any of it, I would be the one who ruined the evening. If I stayed quiet, the lie would grow roots. I could not swallow the food, and I could not swallow the praise. I excused myself to the hallway, and then to the bathroom, turned the lock, and leaned my back against the door. In the mirror, my face looked calm in a way that did not feel like me. I opened my bag and checked the photos again, the emails and the pages from the planner, and the proof steadied me more than water could. I whispered to my reflection that they were using the room to make a story I never agreed to, and that I did not have to accept it. I closed my eyes and listened to the party noises through the door, the laughter, the clink of plates, my mother's voice carrying names and plans and numbers that were always mine. When I opened my eyes again, I knew what this moment was for. It was not the time to blow everything up in anger. It was the time to remember who they were in public and who they had been in private, and to make a plan that would not be twisted back on me. I took a slow breath and went back to the table. My mother squeezed my hand and called me her generous girl. My father kissed my head and told the guests I had a good heart. And Madison whispered that I should smile bigger because people were watching. I did smile small and steady because I understood the game now. They were building a wall of witnesses around their version of me. I was not going to try to climb that wall tonight. I was going to move around it. I passed plates and listened and kept every false line they spoke tucked away beside the proof I already had. I let the room believe I was quiet because I was modest when I was quiet because I was readying myself. The trap was set in front of everyone, and for the first time, that did not make me feel helpless. It made me careful. I carried that thought into the next morning at work, sitting at my desk with a pencil in my hand staring at sketches that would not settle into shape. The voices from last night still echoed, relatives calling me generous, my father boasting, my mother smiling as if the words she had written into her planner had already come true. I pressed my hand to my temple and told myself to focus, but the weight of it all kept pulling me back. That was when Eleanor stopped by my desk. She leaned against the corner, casual, but her eyes were warm in a way that made me pay attention. She said she had been talking with a colleague in Charleston who was searching for a designer with a style like mine. She said they had seen some of my projects and were impressed that the position came with better pay and even relocation help. I laughed a nervous sound that did not belong to me and told her it was kind but impossible. I heard myself list reasons before she even asked about my parents, about Madison's wedding, about how tied down I felt. The words spilled out like excuses I had been rehearsing my whole life. But in the middle of saying them, I caught a picture in my head, just for a second, of a small apartment in a new city where no one knew my family name, where my credit was mine, and my choices stayed mine. The image passed quickly, but it left something behind. Eleanor stayed quiet until I looked at her. Then she said softly, "You have been carrying them for years. You deserve your own life, Emily. Don't let them drain you. The words landed in a place no one had touched before. My throat tightened because she was not asking me to be generous or responsible or patient. She was telling me I could be free. I nodded and promised to send her my portfolio. My voice sounded uncertain, but my hands were already moving to open the files on my computer. I saved the job description she gave me and set it beside the folder where I kept the evidence of my family's lies. 2 paths sat next to each other on my screen. One was heavy with all I had lost, the other was faint but bright with what I might gain. I sat there long after Eleanor left, staring at both, feeling something stir that I had not let myself feel in years. Hope. When I finally walked out of the office that evening, the air felt lighter. The problems were all still waiting, the contract, the lies, the public trap. But now there was also a door I had not seen before. I whispered to myself as I stepped into the fading light, maybe I do not have to play their part. Maybe I can start mine. I carried that thought home like a small light in my pocket and set my laptop on the table, meaning to polish my portfolio for Charleston, but my fingers opened my bank records instead, because if I wanted a new life, I needed to face the old one. I pulled statements, emails, and notes, and I began a simple list I called family loans. I typed each memory into a row with a number beside it. Graduation money that vanished into Madison's spring break trip tuition refunds, handed over for my father's business, the car repair that became a shopping spree, the emergency bills that never came back. Row after row, year after year, I added the costs and watched the total climb until it sat near $70,000. The number did not shout. It just stared back at me like a fact I had refused to read. My chest tightened and I took a slow breath because this was not a mistake. It was a pattern written in dollars and hours I would never get back. I opened my credit report next, something I had avoided because I already knew it would hurt, and the pain arrived on schedule. My score had dropped, not because of the venue, but because there was a new account opened through a bank in my name. The line read like a stranger had borrowed my face. I felt heat rise in my cheeks and then drain away. This was not asking for help. This was taking my name and using it to open doors I never walked through. I clicked for more detail and found a list of recent applications and one pending item I did not recognize. I followed the link to a scanned form the bank had mailed to my address for co-borrower confirmation, and when the image loaded, I sat very still. The handwriting in the margins was not mine. It was my father's neat block letters, the same ones that labelled boxes in our garage when I was a child. The contact number was his. The loan was high interest and large enough to drown a person who already carried student debt and family debt and a future that did not belong to her. For a long minute, I could not move. I thought of every time he said, "Family takes care of family," and how those words had felt like love when I was young, and how now they sounded like a key used to open me without my consent. I slid off the chair and sat on the floor with papers spread like a map around me, and I let the grief come not just for the money, but for the hours I worked, the small things. I did not buy the careful life I built so they could spend it without feeling the cost. The tears were hot and quick, but under them was a steady anger that kept me from sinking. I wiped my face on my sleeve and went back to the table. I saved the spreadsheet and added a clear title so I would never lose it. I took photos of the bank screen and the scanned form and forwarded them to my private email, then dropped copies into the folder I had named Proof. As I worked, I said the numbers out loud, not to punish myself, but to make them real, because what is named cannot hide. I wrote a short note to myself with each file where I found it and what it showed, so that later no one could confuse me about what I had seen. My apartment felt quiet, but not empty. The light from the kitchen made a shallow pool on the table, and in that small circle I felt something settle. I was not going to fix this by paying more. I was going to fix it by telling the truth to the people who needed to hear it, and by telling it in a way they could not twist back on me. I closed the laptop and sat with my hands on the cover, breathing out slowly until my stomach stopped clenching. The debt was bottomless when I let them define what I owed. It became measurable when I put it in my own words. I stood, stretched my back, and told myself the number again. Nearly 70,000. Then I told myself the other truth. My name is mine. I woke with those words still warm in my mouth and carried them to the kitchen like a promise. But before the kettle even sang, my phone lit up with Madison's name and a string of cheerful messages that read like invoices dressed as wishes. She had just toured the bridal suite, and now she wanted the deluxe flower package because the photos would be stunning. And there was a lighting upgrade that would make the first dance look like a scene from a movie. And the planner needed my approval on the ice sculpture deposit today, so everything stayed on schedule. Each message landed with the practiced ease of someone who had never been told no and never worried about how a bill gets paid. I set the phone down and tried to breathe, telling myself to hold steady, but it buzzed again, and my mother's name took over the screen. Her voice came through smooth as a lullaby she had sung for years. She said people were watching, that family would be there from both sides, and it would break her heart if the wedding looked cheap, because guests never forget the feeling a beautiful event creates. She reminded me that family takes care of family and asked in the softest tone if I did not want my sister to be happy. I had nothing left to say that she would hear, so I let her words roll past and ended the call with a careful goodbye that felt like slipping out of a room where the air had grown too thin. I picked up the phone again to mute the thread, and that was when a different alert popped up at the top of the screen. It was from my bank, and it did not use kind words. It said there was unusual activity on my card and asked if I recognised a large pending charge from a travel company. I opened the app and the number made me sit down before I dropped the phone. Thousands of dollars for an all-inclusive honeymoon package in the Caribbean, booked under Madison's name with my card on file. For a moment, the room tilted, and then it settled. And what came next was not panic. It was a clean anger that made everything plain. They were not just building a wedding on my back. They were starting her married life that way too. I pressed the call button for the bank, and when the voice on the other end asked how they could help, I told them my card had been used without my permission, and that I needed the charge blocked and the account frozen. The words came out steady. I asked for a new card number and a fraud alert on my file, and when the representative guided me through the steps, I followed each one until the account looked different and I could breathe again. When we hung up, I set the phone on the table and watched the small screen go dark, and in that quiet, I felt the weight I had been carrying shift. Every chain they tied on me I had learned to carry without complaint. This was the last one, and I had set it down. The phone lit again, and the names returned my mother, with a voicemail about keeping timelines, and my sister with a photo of a seaside cabana and a caption that said she could already feel the warm breeze. I did not answer. Instead, I opened my laptop and the folder named Proof. The spreadsheet sat at the top with its near 70,000 total. Beneath it were the emails, the planner pages, the bank form with my father's handwriting in the margins. I added a new note with the time and the travel company name and the amount they had tried to take. Then I took a screenshot of the fraud alert and dropped it into the folder. I stared at the list of files, each one a small square that held a piece of the story I had been told to deny, and I felt the anger settle into something stronger than heat. It became resolve. I typed a draft of the words I would need when the time came. I am not paying for this wedding. My signature was forged on a contract I did not approve. My card was used without consent for a honeymoon I did not book. I will dispute every fraudulent charge, and I will not be available for further payments or approvals. I read the lines out loud so my voice would know how they sounded. They were plain and true, and I could already feel how they would change the air in any room where I said them. The phone hummed one more time, and I let it. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and drank it slowly until the shaking that I had not noticed stopped. I stood at the window and watched the light slide across the neighbouring building and thought about how many times I had been told to be generous, how many times I had been praised for being strong, when strong only meant silent. I was done being strong in the way that served them. I walked back to the table and opened a blank page and wrote a short list. Freeze all cards, change passwords, set alerts on accounts, save backups of every file, block calls if needed. The list was simple, but it looked like a door. I printed it and taped it inside a cabinet where I could see it each morning. Then I texted Madison one sentence: "Do not use my name or my cards again." She replied with a confused emoji and a question about the honeymoon and a line about how this was supposed to be the happiest time of her life. I did not answer. I messaged my mother a simple note: "Do not make further plans in my name." She called immediately, and I let it go to voicemail. I could hear her speaking through the door of my phone as if we were in the same house, her voice moving between sweet and sharp, but I did not pick up. I sat with the quiet instead and let it teach me what it sounded like when I did not rush in to fix a problem I did not make. I opened the folder one more time and whispered to the screen, "They will see I am not theirs to use anymore," and the words felt right in my mouth. I closed the laptop and rested my hands on the cover and knew that the next time I spoke to them, it would not be to ask for understanding. It would be to draw a line. The room was dim and quiet, and in that quiet, I picked up my phone and called James because I needed one voice that would not try to make this smaller than it was. When he answered, I told him the truth, in one breath, that they had used my card for a honeymoon, that the contract was forged, that my father had written on a bank form, to open debt in my name, and I could hear him go still before he said the words I needed. This is not family. It is fraud. He did not dress it up. He did not ask me to be patient. He said it like a fact, and the floor under my feet felt steadier. He asked what I had, and I opened the folder on my laptop and began to read it out loud, like an inventory of my life. Screenshots of the contract with the false signature, the email where my mother wrote that I would give in, and the reply where Madison said they would figure something out because I had the credit for it. Photos of my mother's planner pages where my name was written beside costs like I was a line item. The scan of the bank form with my father's handwriting and his number listed as the contact. The fraud alert from the travel company with Madison's name on it, and my card charged. As I spoke, I dragged each file into a new folder, labelled in simple words, then I added dates and short notes so nothing could be confused later. James told me to back the folder up, and I did, sending it to my private email, and a cloud drive I had set up years ago for work. He stayed on the line while I worked, and the steadiness in his voice felt like a hand on my shoulder. He asked if I was safe, and I said yes, and then I said something I had not said out loud before. If I do not stop them now, my life will never be mine. The room held that sentence for a long breath. James said I was ready. He said I should talk to a lawyer tonight and notify the venue before they tried to run another payment. He offered to stay on while I wrote. I opened a new email and typed slowly so the words were plain. To the lawyer, I wrote that my identity had been used without consent, that a contract had been signed in my name, that a bank inquiry and a travel purchase had been made with my information, and that I had attached proof for each item. I listed the files and the dates. I did not add emotion because the facts were strong enough. Then I wrote to the venue manager, whose name was at the top of the contract. I stated that I had not signed their agreement, that the signature on file was not mine, that I would not be responsible for any charges tied to it, and that any further attempt to process payments using my name or credit would be disputed as fraud. I attached the images of my real signature from my identification and the page where the forgery sat, and I attached the email thread where my family discussed my supposed gift before I had ever agreed to anything. My fingers shook a little, and I paused with the cursor on send. James did not rush me. He said only that once I sent them, I would not be alone with this anymore. I took a breath and pressed send on the lawyer email. The small sound the computer made felt more final than it should have. I pressed send on the venue email next. When the window closed, I sat back and let the silence fill in around me. I half expected to feel afraid. Instead, I felt a thin thread of relief. The story had been told to someone who would not be fooled by family language. I was not carrying it alone. James asked how I felt, and I told him the truth. Scared, but more sure than scared. He reminded me to keep my phone on silent for the night, to keep copies of everything, and to sleep if I could. He said he was proud of me. Those words landed gently, and I let them stay. After we hung up, I stood at the sink and drank a glass of water. Then I came back and opened the folder one more time, not to add anything, but to see it all together so I could remember that this was real and that I had taken the first step to end it. I closed the laptop and rested my hands there again, the same way I had before I called to James, but the feeling was different now. Drawing a line was no longer a thought. It was in writing. It was on its way to people who could do something about it. I looked around my small apartment and felt a quiet that did not hurt. I knew the next days would be loud, but for this hour the noise belonged to someone else. I was done being the only one who knew the truth. I woke before the sun and moved through my apartment, like every sound mattered, because today the choice I had made in the dark was going to become real in daylight. I checked my phone and saw new messages from my mother and Madison about napkins and fireworks and a last-minute tasting at the bakery, and I let the screen go silent because their noise did not belong to me anymore. I stood at the window with the curtains barely open and watched my parents' car pull out Madison in the back seat beside the wedding planner, all of them dressed for a sweet errand that would keep them busy while I took my life back. I waited until the street was quiet, then called the movers and said it was time. My voice surprised me. It was calm. Within minutes, the truck rumbled up and 2 men in blue shirts came to the door with a hand truck and careful steps. I had labelled boxes the night before and drawn a simple floor plan, and when I handed it to them, I heard myself say, "We will start with the bedroom, then the desk, then the books, please." They nodded, like this was any other move, but for me, it was the first breath after being underwater. While they wrapped my vintage desk and lifted the shelves, I unplugged the small things that had made this place mine, the lamp I found at a thrift store, the framed print I bought with my first bonus, the plant that only grew after I moved it to the window. The apartment filled with the soft sounds of tape and paper and footsteps, and then a sharp knock at the door made all of us freeze. I did not breathe. The knock came again, a little louder. I pictured my mother standing there with a key and a question. The hallway stayed still. No voices. After a long moment, the knock turned into the slide of paper under the door and the soft steps of someone walking away. A flyer from a local shop lay on the floor. I picked it up with fingers that were not steady and let out a breath I did not know I had been holding. The movers looked at me and I nodded. Keep going. We moved faster after that. I packed my graduation photo, the one where my smile was wide and easy, because I believed hard work was a promise that would be kept. I wrapped it in my old sweater and set it in a box marked bedroom. I checked my laptop once more, opened the folder named Proof and confirmed the backups were where they should be, then closed the lid and slid the computer into my bag. I checked my wallet for the new card number the bank had sent and put my phone on Do Not Disturb. A small stack of mail on the counter included the contract I had left out as a reminder. I slid it into a manila envelope with the word fraud written in my own hand so I would not forget how this had started. When the bedroom stood empty and the living room was a landscape of cardboard, I turned to the kitchen and saw the cup I had glued after it broke on the day I learned about the forged contract. The cracks were still visible neat lines that told the story of what had happened even after I tried to fix it. I held it in my hands for a long moment, then set it on the counter with a note I wrote on a plain piece of paper. Some things once broken can never be the same. I did not take a picture of that. I did not need to. The men called from the door that the truck was almost full. I walked through the rooms one last time and said a quiet thank you to the walls that had kept me safe while I learned the truth. I locked the windows, checked the stove, and listened for any sign of a car in the driveway. There was only the steady hum of a city that did not know me and did not ask me to be anyone else. At the door, the foreman handed me a clipboard with a simple form. My hand did not shake when I signed. He said they would meet me at the new place as planned. I nodded and slipped my keys into the envelope for my landlord, with a note about the forwarding address. I stood with my hand on the knob for a second longer than I needed to, not because I would miss this chapter, but because I wanted to feel the exact moment it ended. Then I opened the door, walked into the light of the hallway, and pulled it shut behind me. The sound it made was not loud, but it was clear. I walked down the stairs, stepped into the air, and felt the familiar weight on my shoulders shift. I was afraid they would turn the corner and see me loading the last box. I was afraid of what would come next when the venue called them and the lawyer replied to my email. But fear did not lead anymore. I had chosen my life, and that choice was louder. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and followed the truck. I did not look in the mirror until I reached the first light, and when I did, I saw the outline of my old building grow small. I whispered, I am free, not as a wish, but as a truth I had worked for. And I carried that truth into my parents' house the next weekend with my folder in my bag, and my mind set on saying what needed to be said. The living room was full, voices warm and bright, and before I could take a seat, my mother was already telling an aunt that I would not settle for anything less than the best. My father lifted his glass and said his eldest had insisted on Bellamy Gardens that I had everything covered, and people turned to me with smiles that pressed my silence into a shape that suited them. I let it last one breath longer, then I stood and said that was not true. I said I had not agreed to pay for this wedding, and I would not be paying for it. The room went still, the way rooms do when a simple sentence does not match the story everyone has been fed. My mother laughed lightly and tried to smooth it, said I was being modest, said I hated attention. I took the folder from my bag and laid the first page on the coffee table, the contract with the signature that was not mine, beside a copy of my real signature from my identification, and I spoke slowly so no one could say they did not understand. This is a forgery. I never signed your contract. I placed the next set of pages, the spreadsheet that listed what my family had taken over the years. The graduation money, the refund checks, the car repair that became shopping, the emergencies that never ended, all of it, adding to nearly $70,000. I watched my father look down and then away. I added the scanned bank form with his handwriting on the margins, and his number listed as the contact for a high-interest loan in my name. Then I set my phone on the table and played a short clip of my own voice, telling my mother I could not pay for the wedding, and a text from Madison where she wrote that if I refused, they would figure something out because I had the credit for it. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain beyond what the papers already said. I looked at my parents and my sister and I said the one thing I needed them to hear. I am not your bank. I am your daughter. And you have treated me like a credit card. It was quiet in a way I had never felt in that house. My mother went pale. My father pressed his lips together until they almost disappeared, and Madison tried to speak, but the words caught and fell apart. An uncle cleared his throat and stared at his shoes. A cousin who had called me generous last month looked at the floor. I heard someone whisper that the signatures did not match. Another voice asked about the bank form. My mother reached for the planner on the sideboard, as if a new story might still be hiding there, but there was nothing left to cover the truth. My father said we could discuss this privately, and I shook my head. I said there would be no more private talks about public lies. I said the venue had been notified. A lawyer had been contacted, my cards were frozen and replaced, and any attempt to use my name would be disputed. I picked up each page and returned it to the folder. Then I looked at the people who had clapped for a lie and let them see my face. I did not ask for understanding. I did not apologize for making the room uncomfortable. I said I would not be attending any meeting where I was expected to fix what they had broken, and I would not be paying a cent of this wedding. I tucked the folder under my arm and walked to the door. My mother said my name in a voice that had always made me turn back. I kept walking. My father said, "Family takes care of family." I said that had been my line for too long. On the porch, the air was cooler than the room behind me. I stood for a moment and let the quiet settle inside my chest, where panic had lived for years. Through the window, I saw faces turned to each other, not to me because the story had slipped out of their hands. I went down the steps and along the walk and felt something unclench that I had not known was still tight. I had told the truth in front of the people who needed to hear it. I did not need them to accept it, for it to be real. Aftershocks came fast, and the people who had believed the lie did begin to ask questions. But the first thing that landed on my doorstep was a heavy envelope from my parents' lawyer, and inside was a letter that said I had defamed them, that I had fabricated evidence, that I was out to ruin their good name. My hands shook as I read, not because I doubted my proof, but because I understood what this could do to my new life in Charleston. If a rumour reached the wrong person, if a headline found its way to my new office, I could lose work I had not even had time to love yet. Before I could catch my breath, the second wave hit. My mother began calling relatives and friends with a story about a jealous daughter who hated her sister. Posts appeared online about poor Madison and heartless Emily. A cousin repeated a line about me making up signatures and planting texts. I lay awake in my apartment and watched the ceiling grow pale and then dark, and then pale again, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the letterhead and the bold words and the neat signature from a stranger who would be paid to take their side. At work, I kept my head down, did my job, smiled where I needed to, and still I felt a tremor under my feet. I told James, and he reminded me of every file in my folder, every line in my notes, every date and image and recording. He said the truth had weight and it would hold. I told Eleanor just enough for her to understand why I was walking through my day like I was carrying a full glass, and she put a hand on my shoulder and said, my work spoke for itself, that no one at the firm would be moved by family gossip. That night, I called my lawyer and read the letter out loud. He listened without interruption, and then asked me to send him the package I had already prepared. He told me the defamation claim held no ground if my statements were true and supported by proof. He said their play was to scare me back into silence. We agreed on a response that was plain and firm. We listed the forged contract, the planner pages, the email thread, the bank form with my father's, hand the fraud alert with the honeymoon charge, and we stated each fact without colour. When I hung up, I slept for a few hours, then woke to a message from Thomas, the cousin who had once looked away while I paid for everything. He wrote that the venue had called my parents directly for payment and that he had heard my parents asking around the family for loans. He said people were not so quick to believe them now. Later that day, another call came, this time from a number I did not recognise. It was a friend of Linda, the mother of Madison's fiancé, and she spoke carefully as if walking across a floor that might give way. She said Linda and Charles had heard enough to be concerned, that they wanted Michael protected, that a prenuptial agreement was now on the table, and if the Parkers had expected a rescue, they would not find it with the Carters. I thanked her and hung up and sat very still because the news brought a strange kind of relief. It was not joy at anyone else's trouble. It was simply the feeling of a story losing air. For the first time, I could see that their version of events would not hold forever. That night, the rumours kept coming, and the fear returned dull and steady, but it no longer ran my decisions. I opened my folder and looked at the timeline James had helped me build, and I felt the strength of simple order. I had said no, they had ignored it, they had used my name, I had gathered proof, I had told the truth. When the panic rose, I whispered the same sentence until it passed. This is not family. It is fraud. The next morning, my lawyer filed his response and copied me. He included the attachments, the dates, the notes. He used a restrained language that never once raised its voice. In the afternoon, Eleanor asked if I needed to step outside, and I said yes. We stood on the sidewalk and watched the traffic move. She told me I was not my parents' story, that I was a person who had done the hard work of naming what was done to her, and that no one would take that from me. When I went back to my desk, my reflection in the window looked tired, but it also looked steady. My phone buzzed again with another post about me, and I turned it face down and finished the task in front of me. They were suing, they were talking, they were trying to bury me under the noise of their fear. But the truth had not changed. I had stepped out from under their version of my life, and I was not going back. I kept that promise the next morning when I met James at a quiet cafe near my office. We opened my laptop and spread the last pieces of proof between us, the forged contract beside my real signature, the planner pages with my name written next to costs I had never agreed to the bank form with my father's careful handwriting. The fraud alert from the honeymoon booking the emails, where my mother said I would give in, and my sister said they would figure something out, because I had the credit for it. James checked each file like a builder testing a beam before he signed off. Then we sent the full packet to my lawyer with a short note that said, "These are the facts." An hour later, my lawyer called. His voice was calm in the way that lets your lungs fill again. The Parkers' attorney had reviewed the submissions and withdrawn. There was no case to carry. The words settled through me slowly like warmth after a long cold. I thanked him, then thanked James for refusing to let me doubt what I already knew. On my way back to the office, I noticed the tightness in my shoulders ease. I walked into the studio, ready to work, not to hide. That afternoon, a co-worker stopped by my desk and asked if I could stay late to rush a last-minute change. I felt the old urge to say yes, even though my body ached, and then I heard my own voice answer with simple steadiness. "I cannot tonight, but I will handle it first thing Monday." The reply surprised me in the best way. No apology, no long justification, just a clear line and a promise I could keep. She smiled and said thank you and moved on. It was such a small moment, but it felt like proof that the ground under me had changed. I was not just free of their debts. I was learning how to keep my time and my energy for the life I was building. That weekend, Eleanor and James invited me to a small dinner at a place that served easy food and left you alone to enjoy it. We ate and talked about work and the city and the way the air feels different near the water. When the plates were cleared, Eleanor lifted her glass and said, Family is the people who show up when it matters. James nodded and told me I had been stronger than I realized all along. I did not make a speech. I just looked at them and felt the quiet kind of joy that comes when kindness is simple and true. After dinner, I walked home under a soft sky and let myself breathe in the life I had chosen. My apartment was still half filled with boxes, but it already felt like mine. I took the broken cup from the cabinet shelf where I had set it the day I moved in. The crack lines were still visible, though the glue held. I carried it to the balcony and stood with it in my hands, while the last light slid across the buildings. I did not need the cup to mean more than it was, but as the light caught on those thin lines, I understood something I had not been able to say before. Some bridges burn so the path ahead can finally be seen. I set the cup on the little table by the railing and let the evening settle around me. In my phone were messages I did not plan to open tonight. In my email were contracts and sketches that would be waiting on Monday. Between them was the clear space I had made a place where I could hear my own thoughts and choose what happens next, without asking anyone for permission. I went inside and turned off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway looking at this small place that held my new life. I felt tired and grateful and steady. The fear still visited, but it did not lead. The past still hurt, but it did not rule. I had taken back my name, my credit, my time, and the truth of what had been done to me. I had told that truth out loud and survived the noise that followed. Now, I would learn the slower work of building forward. I set my alarm slid between clean sheets and let the day end without one more fight. In the morning, I would wake to the city and my work and the people who had stayed when it mattered. For now, it was enough to know I had closed a door and opened another, and that I could walk through it as myself. And maybe that is the part worth holding on to, not just for me, but for anyone who has carried a weight they did not choose. Letting go does not mean forgetting. It means deciding you are more than the harm done to you. Some of us find strength by writing it down, seeing the truth on paper where no one can twist it. Others talk with a friend who listens without judgment, or find a counselor who helps put broken pieces in order. Some walk outside each day, letting the rhythm of steps remind them of steady ground. Healing looks different for each of us, but it always begins the same way, with the quiet courage to say, "My life belongs to me." If this story has reached you in a place that still aches, I hope you know you are not alone and that your voice has power even when it shakes. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if you would like to walk through more stories together, you are welcome to join us here. Just subscribe and we will keep sharing voices that remind us we are stronger than we think.